The minimum wage increase from Wednesday. The new wage means that domestic workers should see a 9.6% pay hike. For more on this, we're joined now by Jonathan Goldberg, and he's the Chairperson of Global Business Solutions Labour Market Analysis. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And perhaps for those viewers who may not understand the culmination of where we sit when it comes to that basic minimum wage and really specifically the impact it's had on domestic workers, please provide a little bit of context to where, how we got where we are from tomorrow.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon to you and your viewers. The national minimum wage first introduction gave a discount of 20% to domestic workers and 10% to farm workers. That was phased out over the last 3 years. Effectively, farm workers were phased out in 1 year, the 10% was gone, and domestic workers were phased out over 2 years. So those two sectors over the last 3 years have had significantly higher increases because they had a 10 and a 20% catch-up. So the initial construction to introduce the national minimum wage was to ease the effect on the domestic sector and the farm working sector by giving them an initial discount. Those discounts have now been gone, and the phasing, of course, added to the inflation +1 increase last year, plus it was another 5 or 6% for agriculture and nearly 10% for domestics. And of course, this year there is no phasing at all because we've had 1 year without any differential in all those particular sectors. So there's only one national minimum wage, and there's the exception for workers that work in public work schemes, the so-called public workers that have got a slightly or quite a significant discount to the national minimum wage. But all workers in South Africa would then be covered by a minimum of the national minimum wage, regardless of which sector you work in.
And this is quite a milestone, particularly for the domestic workers, as you say, which have struggled with that discount. But obviously, Jonathan, we have to acknowledge that these are difficult times. So you might find that there are certain industries that are not hiring as much. And so a lot of this talk and the implementation around the national minimum wage may not mean much for many people at this stage, does it?
Yes, well, I think the problem that you have in South Africa, we have a compliant economy and a non-compliant economy. So large sectors of the economy, as we see from research done by credible researchers, doesn't comply with the national minimum wage. And that's a real problem. You need much more effective enforcement, and this across South Africa's business. You've got businesses that comply and other businesses that just get away with wholesale murder in terms of non-compliant. And I think that creates a two parallel stage economy and really unfair competition. And again, I think the enforcement, remember, the only people that can enforce this are government departments, government agencies, because in terms of the law, that's where the enforcement is, really need to step up to ensure that everyone complies with this. And it's a level playing field. I think that's really what business requires. Otherwise, you're competing, for instance, in the retail sector, the traders that are not complying with very many of the laws, including significant legislation like tax collection in terms of VAT.
So that's a very important point, and I wanted to raise that with you in terms of compliance and oversight. Where do we go wrong when it comes to making sure that the relevant authorities are holding the different sectors accountable to the laws and the policies that have been put in place? And why do we fall short here, Jonathan?
I think there are a number of factors. I think a lot of the compliance agencies are short-staffed. They've been depleted over the last couple of years. State capture has obviously come in as well. Bribery and corruption is clearly an element that also they've got to confront. But, you know, if you just think of it logically, just from a VAT collection, a base collection of revenue, if we had better compliance across the receiver of revenue and, say, the Department of Employment Labour, they joined forces and actually went out and enforced both pieces of legislation. In other words, labour legislation, minimum wage legislation, UIF, workmen's compensation and tax legislation. The benefit of doubling the size of the inspectorate and the enforcement mechanism would come straight back into government coffers. And that's what we need to focus on, because it is really unfair for businesses, especially small, medium-sized businesses. We saw in the SONA address, we saw in the Minister of Finance's address, a big focus on small and medium-sized businesses that are taking the brunt of the electricity crisis that we're in. And those compliant companies really face really unfair competition. So my view is we should double the enforcement effectiveness. We should coordinate approaches between departments of government, SARS, Department of Employment and Labour, and really go out with a blitz and a continual blitz. It doesn't help just having a blitz. You've got to keep on the pressure, keep on the enforcement, and lock up people effectively not complying with legislation. Because the research does indicate on the national minimum wage, huge non-compliance in sectors of our economy.
No, absolutely. And also that responsibility on the employer as well to make sure that any employee that they may have is documented and is paying the relevant contributions like UIF. And so I wonder if things like that, Jonathan, would also contribute to some form of compliance and oversight to make sure that as many people, or employers rather, are following the law to the best of their ability.
And that's exactly where I think you need a joint enforcement department that actually collects this together, that works with the National Prosecuting Authority. And can you just imagine the tax revenue that you'd collect and the better protection you'd get for vulnerable workers in respect of just UIF contributions and proper VAT, claiming of VAT. I was at a business last week where they're competing with a business directly in the open public that offers goods without any VAT. Now, clearly, that's easy to police, it's visible, and those kind of companies need to be shut down, and their managing directors and directors need to be prosecuted for criminal behavior because effectively they're not complying with the collection of VAT, as an example. I think if we did that correctly and we really put some impetus behind that, I think we'd have a much better state of compliance, and I think businesses that are complying will continue to encourage complying. I mean, on another point, I think we're also at the tipping point where many businesses are saying, well, should I contribute to X? Take an example, the National Skills Development Fund, the Skills Development Levy of 1%. If I can only get 20% of my claim back, as an example, again, businesses should be able to, with certain preconditions, get majority of that money back, because that's what's intended to do, to train workers of my current organization and potentially future workers.
So, of course, this legislation affects very labor-intensive industries like mining and the retailers, as we've been discussing. But a lot of them have unique bargaining approaches that they have when it comes to negotiating wages and so. So how much of a role does these bargaining councils or the unique bargaining that they would have with the different employees have on the national minimum wage, and whether an employee would be actually getting what has been legislated?
It's a very, very good question. And again, the legislation framework for the national minimum wage is set up to ensure that the national minimum wage doesn't take away from collective bargaining. But let's talk the numbers. I mean, effectively, the increase for all sectors, because we have one national minimum wage, except for the extended public works program, all people get a 9.6% increase on the 1st of March. The average collective bargaining, I would imagine, for last year is around about 7%. So the big sectors that negotiated, including Transnet at 6%, by the way, and including government at 3.3%. You know, the government increase is 3.3%. And now you have a national minimum wage in tough economic times at 9.6%. And I think that the wisdom of that will still be yet be determined in respect of potential job losses and closures of business, because it is a critical time in South Africa. We might be back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the economy, but the load shedding is taking an unbelievable toll on all businesses. And unfortunately, most affected are small and medium-sized businesses that can't afford the luxury of generators and fuel for those generators in these radical stages of load shedding 3, 4, 5, and 6.
Thank you very much for those insights, Jonathan. That is Jonathan Goldberg, who's the chairman of the Global Business Solutions at Labour Market Analysis.